You can't even begin to imagine what he did to her. Nobody could, not really, not unless they had actually seen her that morning, not unless they had seen the blood, how it had dried and caked onto her skin, the bruises that seemed to swallow her arms whole, the look of shame in her eyes, a shame so deep that no amount of dirt or dust could ever truly hide it. Evelyn was barely 23, way too young to be carrying such a heavy burden of horror. Yet, in another way, she was far too old to still be considered a child. And ever since her mother had passed away, she had been trapped in a house that never once felt like a home, not even for a single second. He was her stepfather. The neighbors had stopped asking about her a long, long time ago. Every single time they happened to hear shouting coming from that house, they would simply turn the lanterns down, lower the lights, pretend they heard nothing at all. In a small town, you see, silence is sometimes the cruelest thing of all. A man whose breath reeked of cheap whiskey and whose soul reeked of something far more sinister, something rotten to the core. He didn't raise her. He kept her more like an animal, locked away behind walls and bolted doors. He started with just words, cruel, cutting words. Then came the fists, and then the nights, those long, drawn-out nights that lasted far too long. And on that night, the night the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, he came home even worse than usual. Bottles were swinging loosely in one hand, and a madness was burning brightly behind his eyes. She tried to run, to escape. He caught her before she could get away. She begged him, pleaded with him to stop. He didn't listen. The struggle was brutal, violent. The floor shook and trembled. The air was split open with sounds that no one should ever, ever have to hear. Wood cracked and splintered, fabric tore. Her breath seemed to disappear, stolen from her lungs. When it was finally over, Evelyn couldn't move a muscle. She stared blankly up at the ceiling, as if hoping it might just open up and swallow her whole, but she didn't cry. She had already cried far too much. Instead, she somehow managed to crawl to the door, then to the edge of the porch, and then finally out into the wild, unforgiving desert. No shoes, no plan, just searing pain. The dry, cracked earth scraped against her knees. Cactus needles stung her thighs like fire. Her torn clothes hung loosely from her shoulders like nothing more than dust. She had no idea how long she had been walking. The stars above her blurred into one long streak of light. Every single sound made her flinch, made her jump. A coyote howling in the distance, the wind whistling through the canyons, even her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But still, she walked on because stopping meant remembering, and remembering was something she couldn't bear. At some point, her thoughts just faded away completely. Her body was nothing but cuts and bruises now. Open wounds layered over old scars. Even the moon seemed to turn its face away, unable to bear the sight. She wandered aimlessly through the night, alone and utterly broken. By sunrise, she collapsed near the edge of a dusty trail. Her breath was shallow and ragged. Her skin burned from the rising sun. That's when she heard the sound of hooves, saw a shadow falling over her, a man on a horse. He was tall, older, built like a solid wall of stone. His face was worn by time and by war. His clothes were dusty, just like the land he came from. A red scarf was tied loosely around his neck, and his hand rested gently on the holster at his side. He wasn't just a rancher. He was something else, something colder, something quieter, something that spoke of a past she couldn't even imagine. Evelyn gasped. She grabbed the closest thing she could find, some dried palm leaves. She wrapped them around her body as best she could, trying to hide herself behind a bush. Trembling, her eyes met his. She didn't speak at first. She didn't even know how. But then the words broke free, tumbling out of her mouth in a desperate plea. "I'm begging you. Hurry." She wasn't even sure what she was asking for. Hurry and leave. Hurry and forget that she ever existed. Hurry before she completely broke apart again. But he didn't turn away. He didn't say a single word. He took one step forward, and her heart stopped in her chest. Who was this man? Would he hurt her too? Or was he the first soul in years who would do the unthinkable, not with violence but with kindness? In a place where monsters often wore familiar faces, could a stranger somehow become the only safe thing left? Or was that just another cruel lie waiting to happen? When he first saw her, Thomas didn't think, didn't hesitate. He just moved. Years of soldier's instinct told him that she needed help, and she needed it now. So he pulled off his jacket and wrapped it gently around her, careful not to scare her any more than she already was. She trembled like a leaf caught in a strong wind. Her skin was cold to the touch, her eyes empty and hollow, her lips cracked and bleeding. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't say a single word. He just lifted her gently into his arms, carried her to his horse, and rode slowly toward the ranch. The ride was quiet. Only the wind spoke, whispering through the tall grass. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt something alive in his heart again, a flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness. He had carried wounded men before, many times, but this felt different. This wasn't just duty anymore. This was something he didn't even have a name for. When they reached his ranch, he laid her carefully on an old couch by the fireplace. He lit the fire, boiled water, and brought out a clean cloth. She watched him through tired eyes, not knowing whether she should trust him or not. He didn't look at her the way other men did, with that hungry, predatory gaze. He just kept working, his hands steady and gentle, his breathing quiet and even. Later, when she woke up, she found herself wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Thomas sat across the room, staring intently into the fire. He didn't move, didn't talk, just sat there like a statue carved from silence. She whispered, her voice barely audible, "Why are you helping me?" He looked up slowly, met her eyes for just a second, then said simply, "Because somebody once helped me." She didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, there was peace. The kind of fragile peace that feels like glass about to break. Days passed. Thomas cooked simple meals, carefully tended to her wounds, and spoke very little. Slowly, she started to ask him questions about him, about the medals hanging on the wall, about the scars that crisscrossed his arms. He told her bits and pieces, how he had fought in wars that had taken everything from him, how he had come out alive, but lost the will to stay among people. The ranch was his self-imposed exile, a place to hide from the world until she showed up. Evelyn started to help around the place, cleaning, cooking, trying to give something back in return for his kindness. Sometimes she would smile, just for a second, and Thomas noticed it. He pretended not to, but he did. At night, she still woke up screaming from the nightmares that haunted her. He never went into her room, but she knew that he was sitting awake by the fire, waiting silently until she fell silent again. Two broken people learning how to breathe in the same space, neither asking too much of the other, neither running away. But peace never lasts long in the wild, because somewhere out there a man was asking questions, dangerous questions. He wanted to know where the girl had gone, and he was more than willing to kill to find her. What happens when the past rides back into town, determined to reclaim what it has lost? Will Thomas be able to protect her again, or will he lose everything a second time? For a few weeks, life at the ranch felt almost normal, almost peaceful. Evelyn even laughed again, though never for very long. Thomas fixed the fence, fed the horses, and pretended that the world outside the gate simply did not exist. But peace in the wild is like smoke, insubstantial and fleeting. It looks solid and real until the wind shifts and scatters it into nothing. One afternoon, the sky turned a menacing grey, and the wind carried dust swirling across the hills. Thomas was stacking hay when he saw a figure walking slowly down the dirt road. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy boots kicking up dust. Something in the way the man moved told him that this was not good news. Evelyn glanced out of the window and froze. The colour drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and ghostly. She didn't even need to speak his name. Thomas already knew exactly who it was. The man came closer and closer. His clothes were torn and dirty, his eyes were red and bloodshot, and his mouth was twisted into a hateful sneer. He stopped by the fence, gripped the post tightly, and said in a low growl, "You hiding her here, old man?" Thomas didn't answer. He simply set down the pitchfork, wiped his hands on his pants, and walked slowly toward the gate. The wind caught his hat, but he didn't even blink. "She's safe here," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man laughed, a dry and broken sound that held no humor. "You think you can keep her from me?" Evelyn stepped out onto the porch. Her hands shook visibly, but her eyes were clear and resolute. "Go away," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You've done enough." That only seemed to make him angrier. He pushed open the gate and stormed toward her, his face contorted with rage. Thomas moved faster than a man his age should have been able to. He grabbed the man roughly by the collar and shoved him back hard. For a second, they just stared at each other, both breathing heavily, both remembering different wars that had scarred them in different ways. Then the man swung first. Thomas blocked the punch, then hit back, a swift, brutal blow. A short, hard fight, the kind that ends almost before you realize it has even started. When it was done, the man lay groaning in the dust, blood trickling from his lip, his pride completely shattered. Thomas pointed toward the road. "You come back here again, and you won't walk away next time." The man spat on the ground, crawled painfully to his feet, and backed away slowly. But before he left, he looked up at Evelyn with eyes that burned with a dark, unquenchable fire. "This ain't over," he said, his voice filled with menace. Then he turned and disappeared into the approaching storm. "Inside," Thomas said gently. Evelyn sat by the fire, shaking uncontrollably, but alive. Thomas poured her a cup of water, his own hands still trembling slightly. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded grimly. "Let him try." That night, the wind never stopped blowing. Every creak of the barn made Thomas reach instinctively for his gun. He didn't sleep a wink. Neither did the desert. Outside, Thunder rolled ominously over the hills, the uneasy calm before the next storm had begun. If you're still here, take a sip of your tea. Tell me what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from. And if you want to know what happens when he returns, hit subscribe, stay close, and don't blink. The wind carried the smell of rain that morning. Thomas felt it in the air even before he saw the clouds gathering on the horizon. Storms always came twice in the desert, once from the sky and once from the past. Evelyn was hanging laundry behind the barn when she heard the sound again. Hoofbeats, but not just one horse this time. Two, fast and determined. Thomas stepped out of the workshop, shotgun in hand, his face grim. He didn't even need to ask who it was. Some men, you can hear them coming long before you see them. The riders stopped abruptly at the gate. One was the man he had already beaten and sent packing. The other was taller, cleaner, and far more dangerous. A face that smiled without warmth, a smile that promised only trouble. Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with dread. "That's him. He buys people." Thomas felt something dark twist in his chest, something that wasn't fear, but pure, unadulterated anger. The man in the hat tipped his head slightly, calling out, "Hand her over, old man. We'll be gone before sunset." Thomas raised the shotgun, his grip tightening. "Not a chance." The man laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down your spine. "Didn't think so." Then everything exploded into chaos. The first shot tore through the air with a deafening crack. Splinters flew from the barn wall. Evelyn ducked instinctively behind the water trough, grabbed the small rifle that Thomas had taught her how to use. Her hand shook violently, but her aim was surprisingly steady. Thomas moved with the precision and efficiency of the soldier he used to be. He fired once, then again. One of the horses bolted in terror. The taller man dove for cover behind a rock. The stepfather crawled desperately toward the fence, cursing through his teeth. It was complete chaos, a whirlwind of smoke, shouting, and the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder. Evelyn called out, "Thomas, to your right!" He turned just in time to see the taller man rushing him with a knife. Thomas blocked the blow with the stock of his gun and swung hard, connecting with the man's head. The man fell back, stunned. The stepfather froze, his hands in the air, shaking like a leaf. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes now cold and resolute, her voice steady and unwavering. "It's over." She kept the rifle pointed directly at them until Thomas reached for a rope, tied their hands securely, and led them to the fence. By the time the sheriff finally arrived, the storm had broken, and rain was washing the blood and dust into the thirsty ground. Two men stood in cuffs, their heads hung low, silent for once. The sheriff looked at Thomas, his expression grim. "You did the right thing," he said. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. She was soaked from the rain, her hair plastered to her face, but there was a quiet strength in her now, something that hadn't been there before. Something had changed deep inside her, something that would not break again. As the wagons rolled away, Thomas stood beside her under the grey sky. "You can breathe now," he said softly. She smiled faintly. Maybe for the first time. The wind calmed, the rain slowed, and for the first time in years, the ranch felt like a home again, a place of peace and safety. But peace never stays long in a land like this, because sometimes, even when justice is served, the ghosts still find a way back to haunt you. The rain stopped completely, but the wind still carried a sound, the distant sound of a horse somewhere far off. Maybe it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. Or maybe it was the start of something even worse, something they hadn't even imagined yet. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The land smelled of wet earth and smoke. The sun pushed weakly through the grey sky, spilling a soft light over the ranch. Everything looked new again. Even the air seemed fresher. Thomas stood by the fence, watching the horizon, his eyes scanning the distance. The sheriff's wagons were long gone. The men who had brought darkness into their lives were locked away, far from here, hopefully never to return. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of peace that didn't scare him, a quiet contentment that settled deep in his bones. Inside, Evelyn was making coffee, the familiar aroma filling the house. Her hands still shook sometimes, but her eyes were brighter, filled with a newfound light. She had even started to hum again, small, almost forgotten tunes that drifted through the old wooden house. Thomas listened, pretending not to. But the sound was better than silence, better than anything he had heard in years. Days turned slowly into weeks. The wounds healed, though the scars remained, a constant reminder of what they had been through. Sometimes she talked tentatively about leaving, about starting over somewhere else, somewhere far away from here. Thomas never stopped her from talking, never tried to dissuade her. He just said simply, "Wherever you go, make it better than where you came from." She smiled at that, a sad but knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from pain and gratitude mixed together, the kind that says, "I made it through somehow." Thomas started fixing the roof, replacing one broken board at a time. Evelyn planted flowers near the barn, small white ones that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. He teased her gently for it, said the desert would eat them up in a week. She just smiled and said, "Maybe, but I'll plant more." It became their way of living, a silent understanding between them. He built things that might break, knowing they wouldn't last forever. She grew things that might die, knowing the desert was unforgiving, both knowing that trying was what kept them human, what kept them going. One evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Evelyn looked out at the fields, quiet for a long while, lost in her thoughts. Then she asked softly, "Do you ever think people can really start over?" Thomas thought about it, about the war, about all the years he had spent running from his own ghosts. Then he said slowly, "I think starting over isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without letting it kill you." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The orange light hit her face, soft and warm, making her eyes glow. Maybe that was enough of an answer. Maybe it was all they needed. The world moved on, indifferent to their struggles, but the story stayed, etched into the landscape, because out here, every scar tells a story, and every story like theirs asked the same fundamental questions. How far can you run before you finally decide to stop running and face your demons? What would you be willing to forgive if it meant you could finally breathe again, truly breathe? Maybe the lesson is simple, that no matter how broken life becomes, someone can still walk beside you through the wreckage, offering silent support. Not to fix it, because some things can't be fixed, but just to make sure you keep walking, one step at a time. As the last light faded from the sky, Evelyn whispered, "Thank you, Thomas." He didn't answer, just smiled faintly, tipping his hat slightly toward the sky in acknowledgement. Some words, he knew, didn't need to be said when both hearts already knew them. And maybe that's what this story really was, not just about pain and suffering, but about finding peace in the most unexpected places, about finding hope in the face of despair. If you've stayed with me through the dust and the storm, take a deep breath, let it fill your lungs. Maybe peace isn't something you find, lying in wait somewhere. Maybe it's something you build one day at a time with calloused hands and a tired heart. Out here, under the wide open sky, even the broken things can bloom again, can find a way to thrive. Look around you. Maybe your story isn't over either. And if this tale touched something deep inside you, let me know. Drop a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe so you can ride with us on the next story from the Wild West. Because sometimes the next sunrise brings more than just light. It brings another chance.